is Dan Bolin, and I'm the host of a program called The Courage to Be Courageous, where people come from all over the world to share how they have been able to get through their fear, be their authentic selves, and be able to use courage to be able to do that. So I would like to welcome all of my podcast listeners. I think you're going to find our guest today to be very exciting, and I think you're going to find his story to be very helpful to many of you. Before we start, though, I want to mention that many of you know that I have done a couple of other podcasts. I just want to mention that the Daily Blast Live, which I did in April of 2024, came out live, but you can find it on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and put in the Daily Blast Live, Dan Bolin, then it will show up for you as well. So I hope you'll check it out. It's only a 5-minute interview, actually 6 minutes, and it was a way to get a national voice out there. The Daily Blast Lives goes up to 60 cities in the United States, and I think you'll find it a very helpful and very positive thing for our community. The other one I want to mention to you, back about 3 weeks ago, I did a podcast in Arcadia, California, and the name of the podcast is LGBTQ Archives. And if you go to YouTube and put that in, LGBTQ Archives, then you'll be able to see it as well. It's about 18 minutes. Samaria did an incredible job. He's a concert pianist. He wrote a song for me, and I think you'll find it very helpful and very touching. So I want to remind all my people to check those out as well. And again, if you would like to be on my show, if you would like to be a guest on my show and want to use some courage to be courageous, we would love to have you. And that's at Dan Bolin at Cox.net. So, or if you would like to give me a suggestion on what you'd like to hear on our podcast, we would love that as well. Okay, well, we're going to introduce our guest today. It's Mike. Is it pronounced Krupit?
It is, yes.
Okay, we've got that correct then. Mike, it's such a guest to have you, and I think your story is going to be fascinating, and I think it's going to be quite interesting to people who have come out later in life, as you and I both have. Me later than you. But tell us a little bit about you and your educational history, and a little bit about your career and how you ended up eventually as a CEO, and then also had your own, developed your own company. So Mike, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Born and raised in New York City in the Bronx, attended undergraduate at Queens College, City University of New York, computer science, applied mathematics. Ended up in California initially to do my grad work at Stanford. I hated grad school, but I loved Silicon Valley, and I became a software engineer at startups. And over the course of 25 years, participated in growing 8 companies and grew my career from software engineer to chief technical officer to chief operating officer to chief executive officer, and spent the second half of my career leading and building companies. And about 10 years ago in 2013, I decided to take the skills that I had developed for myself and my organizations and turned it into a practice doing leadership development, organizational development, and business growth coaching. And that company is Trejectify, and I've been doing that for almost 11 years. August will be our 11th anniversary. And I got married right out of college, and I took my young wife with me to California, and there we eventually moved back east, and we're in Philadelphia now. But I was married to her for 35 years, and we raised 2 beautiful children.
Excellent. Now, Mike, tell us a little bit about when you noticed that you were, let's say, different or gay, and how you dealt with it at the time when you knew you were different than other boys.
I will say that some of it's fuzzy, but for the most part, I remember being attracted to other men at the time, or other boys at the time. I was in my mid-teens, perhaps. Nothing specifically happened. I was part of a group of nerds, and as nerds, we did things like, played Risk on Friday evenings for 6 hours, and other nerdy kind of stuff. Not quite Dungeons and Dragons, but we would have fit in well with that crowd. So I mean, for the lack of a better word, I ignored it. I was attracted to men, but I wasn't dating girls either. I just was my geeky self and ignored those feelings until I got to college.
Well, tell us what happened when you got to college.
Well, when I got to college, I said, all right, well, look, I might be attracted to men, but I'm going to date women because this was the 1980s. It was the Reagan era, the AIDS epidemic, the blaming gays for not only their behaviors but for the diseases, and it's like, who wants to choose that lifestyle? And so I dated women. I dated women for my 4 years in college. I did have an affair with a man while I was in college, and that affirmed for me that my attraction was real. Um, but I don't know. Unlike some gays, I wasn't repulsed by women, so I found a path to say, all right, I'm going to live it. I'm going to do this the straight way. To misuse that word, I'm going to do it the straight way, and that's how I followed the straight path.
Excellent. So now you were married to your wife at the time, correct?
So we graduated college. I got married at 22.
Okay.
Again, today, way too young to get married. I mean, look, our brains weren't fully developed, but we got married because it felt comfortable, it felt safe, and we moved to California together. Yeah. So I got married at 22.
Did you feel like it was kind of the thing to do and have the marrying, have children, have the white picket fence? Did society put some of that pressure on you, or unknowingly maybe it did?
Of course. No, of course. I didn't know any gay men personally. And look, I grew up in New York City, right? There was plenty of gay men in my circle, my community, of my circle of friends, my family, my extended family. I didn't know anyone who was gay. Many gay men didn't come out back then. And while we were a relatively liberal family, I was raised Jewish. There was nothing about gay being evil. Nobody came out as gay. And so I didn't have those role models. All I knew was the gay life was hard. You saw the news about gay men dying of AIDS, and it was like, no, that's not the life I want for myself. And I'm going to do it the way everybody else I know does it. And I'm going to, date the woman and get engaged to the woman and marry the woman and have kids and, make my parents and my grandparents proud.
But at the time, that was the right thing for you. I get that. But in reality, even though it was buried, you were not being your authentic self with
Not at
you.
all. Right,
Yeah.
right. No, I mean, I can look back. I mean, it was during the course of the marriage that I realized what I had done. The advent of the internet, right? The commercialization of the internet. Even with just dial-up modems, where you can dial up to these online bulletin boards and start to, I guess we call the BBSs, right? The bulletin board services, where you can find like-minded people. And then the dial-up services like the Prodigy, the AOL chat rooms, right? A very historic for closeted, discreet married men to meet one another and have conversations with one another. It wasn't really until midway through my marriage that I realized what I had done to myself, and of course what I had done to my wife.
So how did you come out to your wife? Or I guess in a sense, we could say you were kind of found out by your wife.
Yeah, I mean, the story went, it was the beginning of the pandemic. It was the beginning of the pandemic, and neither one of us had really worked from home at the time. I guess I worked from home more frequently. My wife was in education, so she spent most of her time in schools and centers. And so this was the first time that we were really together, all day long and all evening long and 7 days a week. One day, early in the pandemic, I happened to have my phone with me while I was making lunch upstairs. My home office was in the basement. Her home office was off the kitchen. And I had one of my uh, gay chat apps open, and I went to make lunch, and I forgot I left my phone out there in the open, and she saw it and asked me about it, and I was kind of forced to reconcile what to do, right? There were a couple of times in our marriage where she had suspicions, but they were easily dispelled. But here she was with the evidence in her hand, and I made the decision at that point to, I don't know, be brave, be vulnerable, and I told her.
And be courageous,
Mhm.
because
Well, yeah,
you could have tried to cover that over again, but there's something that you said, she knows it's an opportunity for me to use courage to get through this.
yeah.
Would you describe it that way?
Well, it takes courage to be vulnerable. It does.
Yes.
And I remember when we had been going through marriage therapy and earlier on, before I came out to her, you know, the the therapist, who was a very good therapist, but was having trouble breaking through to me being okay, being vulnerable. What he and my wife didn't know at the time was, well, because I had built up these walls around my emotions, around myself to protect my secret. And so he tried whatever he could to get me to be vulnerable, and I couldn't. And it was at that moment that, with her holding my phone with the Grinder app open, that I realized it was the time to be courageous and let myself be vulnerable.
How did she respond?
Um, a lot of different emotions. Clearly shock, um, sadness, anger. How could you do this to me? Why'd you keep a secret from me? I know it, in hindsight, there was some empathy in there. It's like, oh man, how could you be going through this? And we were friends, right? We weren't just, husband and wife, we were friends. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure she was feeling at that moment a lot of emotions, but she was just plain out hurt.
Of course, yeah. It's courageous on your part to recognize the pain that you caused her, as because you're a gay man. And I think that's very courageous for you, allowing you to think about your wife's emotions as well, because they get hurt too, just like many of our kids and family gets hurt. So to be able to understand that hurt, I think is impressive. So talk a little bit more from your coming out to your wife, coming out to your kids. Tell us a little bit about how that transpired, Mike.
Well, yeah, so the story goes, it was very methodical. In hindsight, I can say it's methodical. I don't know. It didn't feel very controlled
Didn't
at the
feel that way
moment.
at the time.
But I agreed to go into therapy, and given that we were in the pandemic, therapists were working virtual, and so I was able to pick and choose a therapist who was had experience in the space that I was feeling I was in at that moment. I went into therapy to try to to get over the shame, to get over the guilt, to be comfortable with knowing what my identity was, and to put together a plan for how to move forward. And it took me about 6 months to get there, and made it clear to knew that I wanted to be with men. My wife and I have both have relatively traditional values, and we both believe that marriage would be monogamous, and so the marriage didn't really allow room for me exploring my sexuality given that core value. And so we decided to separate. To tell the kids that there were some, potentially some irreconcilable differences. We didn't tell them what it was. And it was good. It was a good time in the real estate market to sell the house, which is what we were planning to do anyhow at that stage of our life. So we we told the kids about, and our families about the fact that we were separating, and we sold the house and we each moved into our own place.
Let me ask you a question because I think this is important for my audience to understand. When you came out with when your wife confronted you and you finally admitted to yourself that you were gay, did you have any sense of peace at that time that you know that you were really telling the first person who you authentically were? Was there any sense of peace?
I mean, not unlike my wife, I had a lot of mixed emotions. Um, excuse me. Um, there was a huge sense of relief, right? I mean, it was like, I mean, I was grateful for the fact that my secret of nearly 60 years, well, I mean, let's just say 40 years of adult life was out. Um, Secrets are an awful thing, right? And
So how did you feel about that?
well, so there was a great sense of relief. There was also a sense of excitement. It's like, all right, well, what's next for me? But there was just it was, but it was also overwhelmed by fear, right? So we think about it. I'm giving up everything I knew, right? We were at the point of our lives where we were planning retirement. And so, you're thinking about that final chapter, not starting a new book. And the that that's, one can only project to say, this isn't going to end well for me. I'm in business for myself, and so I'm self-employed. And so if my business tanks and I can't care for myself and I don't have a wife to care for me anymore, and we're splitting all our retirement savings. So how long is that going to last for me? And oh, by the way, I'm going to get sick and there's going to be no one to care for me. So I had this vision of myself in this horrible place of in a dimly lit room with a light bulb swinging from the ceiling off of some electrical cord, barely any furniture, just dying alone. And it was there was some pretty fearful moments.
And Mike, I think you and I talked about it because I actually share that in my memoir. Is the fear that we have, and I always said FEAR, false evidence, but it appears real.
Mm-hmm.
So most of our fears, and usually almost all of them, really never come true. But in our mind at the time, they're true. Okay. Uh, Tell me what your fear was about what you did. You talked about losing your family. Uh, you had a tremendous amount of fear. Out of all the fear that you just mentioned, how much of it came true?
None of it. None of it. And that's true of, look, I do leadership development. I do coaching as part of my business practice. And so I know what fears do to us, but I also know that almost never do our fears come true. They are not based upon data often. They're based upon emotion. Fear is an emotion. And so I like to define fear as, an emotion surrounding something that's likely never to happen. And that's another point where it's important to be courageous, right? To understand those fears. So what worked for me, and by the way, my fears were compounded by the fact that I joined all of these online groups for men going through my situation. So how husbands out to wives, gamma for gay men who are in a married or committed relationship with a woman. And so I got a ton of peer support, and I could have not done this without that peer support. But I also heard all the horror stories of men who had gone through this process or were going through this process a little bit ahead of me, and some of the challenges that they were facing. And that while the peer support group helped me overcome my fears, they also created fears in me. It's like, oh, what if that happens? And what if my kids never talk to me? And what if I lose my job, or my community shuns me, or I can't afford to retire? I saw so many different things happen to so many different men that my eyes being opened, it compounded the fears.
Mhm.
But
But it also help you, and we're going to talk about that a little later.
yeah,
They compounded your fears, you're saying, but it also helped you with your fear.
well,
Because
right.
both can be true.
So it gave me, because I got enough inspiration from seeing those who had been on the other side of the process and they had happier lives. I got the accountability, the support and the accountability I needed to take that one step at a time through this journey. And I got to see my eyes became opened to all the possibilities that are out there that, having been raised with such heteronormative values, um, that, when I'm looking at a gay community of men who had followed and, whose journey I was following in, I was able to see that there's not just one way to do it. And so it opened my eyes to possibilities that I hadn't considered before because of all that programming and scripting that I had developed over the decades.
And I think what I realized, because I've been a part of Gamma now 2 years, which I think is an incredible organization. In fact, we did a interview with Harry Fox, who's one of the facilitators of Gamma.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm in a beautiful relationship. I've been happier than I've ever been in my whole life. I have a great partner. Um, so I try to be an encouragement through Gamma with my story, as all of us try to do, to be that as well. But I think there is similarities in our story, but each of our stories is unique. It's unique to us. And so we've got to understand that the stories can be encouraging, but there's going to be some stories on there that may not be discouraging for our unique life. Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what, and I've always believed in community, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But I want to talk about how you came out to your son and your daughter. Tell us how that happened, Mike.
Yeah. My son is older. He's 31 today. Then my daughter's 29. He lives in Florida. He's a teacher down there. He is when he moved to Florida, he moved to a very conservative county with a very conservative community, and he took a job with very conservative leadership, and it was all very comfortable for him, and that's how he identified. And I was really nervous about coming out to him because, well, how much more progressive can your dad divorcing your mom to come out as gay be? And I was worried that maybe he wouldn't accept me, or I was worried that he may not get the support from his community
Oh,
as
okay.
as he was going through his dad coming out. And so I flew down to visit him in Florida, and I stayed at an Airbnb, and I came to his house one night on a Wednesday to tell him, and I chickened out. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Wednesday happened to be the Philly Gamma meeting, so I went back to my Airbnb and got on the Gamma meeting, and the guys were there, and they were very supportive and very encouraging, and it gave me the confidence. It helped me build my courage to go back the next night and do it. And at that point, his mom and I, my wife and I, had been separated for I don't know, 8 months maybe. Um, he just didn't know why. It was irreconcilable differences. So I explained to him why. He says, I kind of get it now. And then he said something to me that struck me. He said, first he said, it's okay with him, right? And that was a little sigh of relief.
Mhm.
And then he said that he wished I had done this sooner in life, because for the past year I've been so much easier to be around.
Oh, wow.
And
What a
and
powerful comment.
that was, So it was a very emotional moment for me. And, later that night when I drove back to my Airbnb, I was in tears for a half hour, kind of relieved and also really
Mhm,
happy.
mhm,
I'm really happy and really encouraged. Um, that and you know what? Ironically, that week, the Brene Brown HBO spec was it Netflix? Her Netflix, I think it was HBO or Netflix. I forget. She did a 5-part series.
yes.
Um, but I watched the opening episode, and she said something there, and I'll probably paraphrase her because I don't remember exactly how she said it. But she said in the introduction that the relationship we have with others can only be as deep and meaningful as the relationship we have with ourselves. And it's
Powerful.
like, and so my son tells me this, and then Brene Brown tells me that. And it's like it was like a big aha moment for me. It's like none of my relationships have been authentic because I haven't been authentic. And I began to be encouraged by the fact that the relationships in my life will be better now because of this step that I had taken, how far I've come along that journey thus far. And I've come a lot farther since then. But it was those moments of of a validation that,
Mhm,
hey, this could be working,
mhm.
that encourages you to sort of to remain vulnerable and to ignore the fears, to be courageous and to move forward down that path.
I want to share this thought because that what you said was so powerful, Mike. And I believe that wholeheartedly. And my story, I think, indicates that when we are ashamed or hate who we are, then you cannot pass on authentic self. What you pass on is a false self. And I think for me, when I began to deal with and work through the shame, and my shame was horrendously strong. But when I was able to deal with my shame and move through that and realize I'm a beautiful gay man, I began to love myself for who I am. And now what I can pass on to others is the authentic Dan.
Yeah.
And we'll use everything we can to beat ourselves down, deny who we are, try to fit into society. Uh, and I said this on my podcast before that nobody defines who I am. Not religion, not my partner, not my community. I define who I am. Now, I can bring people in my life that compliment me, but they don't they don't not define who I am. And I think that
Yeah.
was very powerful. And you really kind of articulated that you were able to pass on yourself when you became your authentic self to you were able to pass that on to others. I
Yeah.
think that's a courageous story. So tell us how you came out to your daughter.
My daughter was a little bit more straightforward. She and I have a close relationship. She's an adult with special needs, so we spent a lot of time together. My ex-wife now and I, share in caring for her and helping her live an independent life. And so, coming out to her was very easy. She was very accepting. She has a lot of, diversity of friends, neurodivergent friends, and so so with my daughter it was much easier.
Mhm.
As so it reminds me of something I use in coaching, which is the sort of eat the frog parable, where I think it was originally from Mark Twain, right? But if one of your jobs each day is to eat a frog, start the day by eating the frog first, right? Don't dread it all day long. Do the hard thing first.
That's
um
a great analogy.
it is, and I think Mark Twain goes on to say, if your job is to eat two frogs, eat the big frog first. um, and and so we and so that's why I after coming out to my wife, that's why my son was next, right? It's like, and once I ate that frog, it's like I could take that next step a lot more easily. And that was the important element of my journey, is really and my therapy especially, but the Gamma guys certainly have followed this philosophy themselves as well, one step at a time, right? So, come out, be okay with myself, come out to my wife, figure out what to do with my wife. Live alone. I commuted to college, and so I lived at home with my parents, with my family. And then right from college, I got married. I had never lived alone in my entire life.
Hmm.
I was near 60, when I got my own apartment at however old I was, 58 years at the time. That was the first time I ever lived alone.
Wow.
So for me, it was, just a lot of one step at a time. First get good at this, and then get good at that, and then get good at that, right? And so that after these first, big frogs that I had to eat, it was, the rest of it was a little bit easier to take each subsequent step.
I'm going to make an illustration about your frog because it's a great analogy. I think you eat the bigger frog first, and the frog in your mind is bigger than the one you eat because you think it's a huge frog, and it really isn't. So, because people put this in their mind that, and I think that's where courage comes in. Eat the frog first, and the frog you eat will not be as big as your mind thinks it is. It'll always be smaller. And that's my take on it.
And it might be, and even if it's not, when it's done, it's done.
Yeah.
Right? You ate the frog. And so we get through it, right? The fear doesn't come true.
And I want to commend you on my coming out in later years because I think you came out to your wife when you were late 50s.
Mhm.
Your son was there, your son, and then you came out professionally, probably close to 60. Tell us how that
Yeah.
went.
But it was so after I came out to family and friends, I didn't make a big deal of it. I didn't want to be that gay man that defined himself in the world by, as being gay, right? There's a lot more parts to me, and especially in business, my being gay in business has no bearing on my business whatsoever. But what I found increasingly was when I would share this story with a client or a prospect or a colleague, or part of the story, really, I never really told anyone the whole story, but when I shared part of the story, um, the comment would be, that's pretty inspiring. And I realized that I could perhaps, if I shared more of the story, that others who are facing difficult journeys, difficult decisions that are hard to make, or facing some fears, or are lacking confidence, or not willing to be vulnerable, that I can potentially say, share with them the huge journey that I had been on and what it was like on the other side, and some of the ways that I successfully got through that journey that made me stronger and happier and better, and that worked. And so I could use my story as inspiration to help them through whatever challenges they might be facing.
Wow.
And so I told the story. I wrote it up and I told the story. Uh,
and that shows a lot of courage on your part, coming out late in life to your peers and or those that you are your clients in your company, coming out to your wife, coming out to your kids. So, how's your relationship with your wife today?
we remain friends. We speak a couple times a week. I see her once a week. Often, around transporting my daughter, but we we're both in a better place now. And look, the journey was as hard for her as it is for me. So I'm not gonna I don't want to minimize that fact that, by me making this choice and me having hid such a large part of myself from, the woman who was my wife and best friend, created a lot of pain and a lot of difficulty for her. But she's now in a better place. She's happier and I'm happier than where we were before this happened. And and so I think that I think that's good for both of us in having taken very difficult journeys over the past few years.
Excellent. Um, are you, would you be saying that, are you saying that you're the happiest now than you've ever been?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I am. I am. I and I remember in a therapy session a couple of years ago, I was struggling with a romantic relationship, because look, dating at 60, right, is completely different than 40 years ago. And I was not only 20, but dating was completely different back then. And dating men instead of women. And so there was a lot of newness for me. And in some ways felt like a teenager because I had no idea what I was doing. And I felt like I was making a lot of mistakes, newbie mistakes, perhaps. But I was learning. I was learning what worked for me and what didn't work for me. And I think that one of the lessons for me was, if you don't know what you want, at least go figure out what you don't want. And that's progress. But I was struggling with a particular relationship, and I forget where I keep breaking out into these tangent stories. So I forget where I was heading with that one. Um, but the what I realized at the time was I didn't know. I wasn't sure if I knew what happiness was. I had spent so many decades building up these walls around my emotion that not only could I not feel those emotions, but once I started to feel them as I broke down those walls, I probably didn't know how to regulate them. And so there was a lot of getting good with emotion. So I wondered if I even knew what happiness looked like or felt like. And it took me a while to appreciate what happiness was, to be able to recognize and embrace the emotions that I was feeling, when something wasn't working, to understand how I might be hurting or feeling sad, or when things were going well, to understand what exhilaration truly was and what happiness that led to. And so I've grown a lot since, and know now that I can recognize those emotions, and know for a fact that I'm happier than I have ever been. Um, in part because now I think I know what happiness feels like. I think I know what happiness looks like, and I could have never happened when I was inauthentic, not vulnerable, and hiding my emotions.
Wow, what a great lesson you've shared with all of us just then. I think that's really a powerful thought. One of the things that I always ask my podcast guests, uh, you have a very courageous story. You went through a lot of fear and you embrace the fear by using courage. And that's the reason my podcast is called The Courage to Be Courageous. But we're going to have all different types of people listening to this. Some are going to be gay, transgender, some are going to be bi, some are going to be straight allies. But they may be struggling with something in their life right now, that is keeping them from progressing to where they want to be their authentic self. Mike, share some of the lessons of your story and a thought or two how your story would help these people.
Yeah. So a couple of the lessons I've already shared. First one is, um, the importance of facing our fears. That our fears are these emotions that are not going to come true, and um, so just acknowledge them for what they are, and don't let them stop you. The second is the strategy of really the one step at a time. It's easier to minimize those fears if we're just thinking about that little step.
Mhm.
Um, a story I haven't shared yet, that I've shared with others, is when I was younger, I took the kids on a rappelling vacation. I'm afraid of heights, so jumping off a cliff really wasn't my thing. Well, for whatever reason, maybe I had to prove something to myself. We got a guide and we went rappelling in West Virginia. And I get in the harness and I get the rope and I get to the edge of the cliff and I'm supposed to bend down, sit back and go off the cliff. My knees buckle. I can't. And it probably took 20 minutes of coaching for the guide to get me off the cliff. And what ended up working was the one step at a time, what we call, I think he called, I forget what he called it, but it was he broke it up into all these micro steps. And he said, all right, well, turn your back to me. Turn your back to the cliff. Okay. Take half a step back with your right leg, bend your left knee. And he must have given me like 50 or 60 tiny instructions that successfully got me off the cliff. And that's really, if we focus on a bunch of tiny steps, each step takes us forward, and we're not hindered and we're not obsessed over the fears of the audacity of the goal that we might be trying to achieve. So one step at a time. And the final thing is, I couldn't have done this without support. I needed that therapist. I needed that peer group. And no matter what each of us is struggling with, we need to seek out that support. It's there. It's even there for free. I mean, Gamma doesn't charge anything. There are organizations where I could have approached for free counseling for people who are trying to, in our case, LGBTQ and coming out, but don't do it alone. Don't do it alone.
I think that is such a good point, because I'm a big part of community, LGBTQ community. I didn't have a community when I was disfellowshipped from the church, because I lost all my family and friends except my daughter. Mm-hmm. And I went out and sought a community because I knew I couldn't do this on my own.
Yeah.
And so if we don't have a community, search for one. Sometimes a community doesn't necessarily come to us. We have to go out and find a community. And as I've shared many times on this, I'm a part of Front Runners and Front Walkers International. Great organization. They do a lot of good things for the community, but you can go there, be yourself, authentic self. Nobody's going to even ask you whether you're bi, straight, or transgender. They're just a community of support and help, and you can be your authentic self. And I just want to echo what Mike just said there. Find a community, find an organization. Gamma's a great one too, to become a part of a community. Because sometimes we have a tendency to think it's just, we're all alone in this. But these organizations have to understand, no, you're not alone in this. There's a lot of people like us, even though our story is unique as well. Mike, it's been such a pleasure having you on my program today. I want to thank you for your courageous story. I know many of my podcast listeners will gain some good insight if they're struggling with whatever fear it is in their life, to be able to come out as their authentic self. So I thank you very much for this podcast. It was such a pleasure spending time with you.
Likewise. Thank you for the opportunity, Dan, to share some of my story.
Okay. Thank you so much.